The title is, I'm supposed to just say the title.
Well, that's in the show.
Farm to Google. The issue is the economy. And the question is, does expanding the tech industry hold the key to bridging America's economic divide?
Welcome to Political Playlist.
All right. Are we ready, guys?
Happy hour.
Happy hour.
We fucked that up so bad.
So a little bit of background for you guys. 30% of rural communities were downwardly mobile after the recession in 2008, 2009. And we are also at a point right now.
Can you repeat that? Downwardly, what does that mean?
Downwardly mobile, like their economic fortitude was decreasing. So after the recession, most of America was on an upwardly mobile.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
Like people were getting better. But 30% of rural communities in America were downwardly mobile. So the recovery of the recession was not helping them at all. In fact, it was doing the opposite. Then flash forward 10 years later, we're in perhaps the most divided politically climate. And a lot of that is a divide between urban and rural Americans. One of our progressive members of Congress, Ro Khanna, who is from California, he represents Silicon Valley. He's on the Congressional Antitrust Caucus. He has a new book called Dignity in a Digital Age. And this book lays out Ro's vision for democratizing the digital economy. So the tech industry basically going to places like Kentucky and Iowa, and Ro acting as this ambassador, since he represents the sort of most fervently tech part of the country, as an ambassador to go to these places and help build these new tech economies. So what do you think about this? Like, does this sound valid? Does it sound like a pipe dream?
I'll tell you what, the Wi-Fi at my parents' house is really, really spotty sometimes. So can it help with that?
I mean, maybe. I think that the idea is like getting what he said that's so interesting is that most of the time for young people in this economy, if you want to go work in the tech industry, say, and you grew up in rural Iowa, you're not hanging around rural Iowa. You're moving to California, you're moving to Austin, you're moving to one of these big centers. So the idea is like, let's keep the people. Like a lot of people do want to stay, but they can't. So let's keep the people where they're at, So I don't know, maybe it would help with the Wi-Fi.
Great idea.
Yeah.
Great idea for sure. Love ideas.
What are they going to call it?
Anthony's the idea man.
What is the Silicon cornfield?
No, they do have a name in Kentucky for it though. It's called, I'm going to have to look it up.
Here's what I think
criticism,
is
per usual.
Yeah, of course, because that's what I'm here for. It's a great idea, but we are also seeing the government get in major fights with big tech, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I'm interested to see how that plays out and how it would affect a decision like this. What I think instead the government should do, which they probably won't because they're morons, is to utilize them and put restrictions on them, which forces them to possibly invest their money in these areas and to build certain things out in these certain rural areas.
Well, that's part of Ro's argument is that like it would be beneficial for these companies to expand and diversify their workforce. Like it would be beneficial for them financially. That's part of what he's arguing. Whether or not that happens, I think your point is valid.
Let me ask a question on this. So is there some sort of tax incentive for big tech to do this, to sort of broaden out, create the infrastructure necessary in order to be a jobs creator in these more rural areas?
So not yet, but there is a bill that is primarily working to make the U.S. more competitive with China, which is something that is obviously has like bipartisan support around it, that we need to be more competitive with China. So I think that what Ro is kind of saying is that you can't just say, oh, we're going to break up big tech. You have to say, we're going to break up big tech and we're going to implement systems like tax incentives or things like that would help create new, smaller tech economies around the country. And I think that, another thing that I thought was really interesting is that COVID helped prove that this is all possible. And that's what he was saying, is that everyone thought this was like a pipe dream. They thought it was dumb. And then in COVID, people left big cities and went and worked remotely from their hometown or places that were less expensive. And all of a sudden you actually had these mini economies in other places. The problem is that there's no actual physical infrastructure there. So if they can move parts of the companies to these places, the workers have already shown that they want to be there. And I have friends that have, I don't know, do you guys have friends who have left the city and moved places that are more affordable? Or
I have zero friends to begin with, so I can relate.
Any questions about friends is a really touchy subject for Anthony.
Yeah, that makes sense why he poured himself a double scotch. I have a friend who works at Snapchat, and she has lived all over and now is living in Austin, Texas, I think. The question is, is this also a really good driver for local economies, right?
That's the idea.
The more people you have staying or maybe even relocating, then theoretically more housing that you need to either build or
so
rent.
that's something that he addressed, which is that if you just say, oh, we're going to send a bunch of people who are making a lot of money to these areas, it's not going to help the economy. It's actually going to increase the wage gap. But if you put the physical infrastructure, et cetera, in place for people to have the desire to move there and work there and live there, then you can actually start to close this economic divide, which is sort of my overarching question. Because I think that the validity to this is you already have shown that there's a desire for people to spread out in COVID. And so if you can use that desire and couple it with, again, this is government funding. So there, it might be hard to get people on board with spending the money to do this, but I think that's
maybe bring the physical location, a Blue Bottle, a Lululemon, and you got yourself a town, right?
I dig.
That's the basic bitch town. Yeah.
Well, so we'll call it BB Incorporated.
I think, especially this coming from Ro, hey, he's in charge of the Silicon Valley, very forward thinking, which I think is great. My issue, I think, where it might not translate today, but it will in the future, is the people who are in charge of these departments are much older and who still kind of believe in this whole be in the office. You got to come in at, once a week still. I don't think they're fully let go of this not working in the office.
But that's what he's saying, is it's building offices. It's not saying
it's
go
tough
work remotely.
To build an office.
Right. But I think he's saying if you
it's tough to build an office. And anyone knows who's at a big company.
How hard could it be? You just put up some brick.
And that's why it takes the funding to do it. I just think I have one more question before we move on. Yes, it's hard to build an office.
We're not moving on. We're gonna keep talking about this, Anna.
Yes,
you're in such a rush.
Yes, it's hard
to rush for.
I know, because Anthony started getting all negative, and I didn't like it.
Oh well, you gotta fight
speaking
negative.
My mind.
You know what? What I do?
What?
Just real quick. I just take a beat. But actually, though, we should move on for time, Anna.
No, I have one other thing about this that I'm curious.
Just one? I'm shocked.
No, I really just have one. I was very organized today. So what I find most interesting, because I'm an emotional person, is the sort of
episodes 1 through every one.
I haven't cried yet on here. It'll happen someday.
Challenge accepted.
What I think is most interesting from a political perspective beyond the economy is the ideological divide between rural and urban America is so big right now. And I think that's actually where you see a lot of the sort of rhetoric culminating, right? You kind of have, especially in COVID, we really saw that, right? Rural communities being we can take care of ourselves, cities being we really need help. So what I think is potentially very interesting about this from a socioeconomic or sociological perspective is what Ro says is that this bridges the digital divide that somebody like Trump and sort of the repercussions of Trump exploited. And that if you have this kind of melding of what had previously been an urban industry into more rural communities, suddenly you're creating a dialogue, even if it's not about work, but you have people sort of with different backgrounds and different interests and different perspectives living in the same place. And that actually, we know we've talked about it before, when you have a conversation with someone, it can really change things.
The first step here is broadband internet.
Totally. And we have a lot
I know that's part of the infrastructure bill.
I was thinking like we have Antonio Delgado works on that a lot, Elise Stefanik.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who are really pushing for the rural broadband. Totally.
Well, and it's interesting. It seems like this is such a play out of the auto manufacturing playbook, right? Where, and what'll be interesting to see is if, both parties can sort of subscribe to this idea of job creation, technological advancement, and in many ways, a sort of forced diversification of the rural areas, right? So to your point, more people who work in tech are going to have new, different points of view, and that is going to be coming into rural areas, which, might not have that same diversity that a, major city might have as far as, that sort of thought and ideology when it comes to policy. And so I guess it'll be interesting to see if this can find bipartisan support, or if this is something that is just going to be yet another political wedge between two parties.
I think that framing it around domestic production of things like microchips and all of that there's been a real bipartisan push for that. That could be a really interesting place to start, because we might think of tech as like Facebook, but tech is also more than that. It's also
this is where our government should pivot here.
We're in the middle of a pivot.
Honestly, they what they should be doing is doing a 10-year infrastructure plan with each big tech firm across the US.
Whoa.
And
time for Anthony to go to the Capitol and pitch his ideas.
You hear about Apple having so much money overseas and they don't want to bring it in because of taxes. You're like, hey, we'll give it to you tax-free, but pick 20 cities that you're going to bring that money to. Over the next 10-year period. And because this isn't going to happen overnight, obviously, this is like a long-term idea here, which I love. It's just, you're not going to do it until you twist the hand of big tech.
Right.
And instead of regulate them, which I'm kind of for because they have everything on me. But this might be a better solution. Maybe a middle of the road one.